Dive-In.
Bienvenidos a Dive-In.
Witajcie na festiwalu Dive-In.
Welcome to the Dive-In Festival.
Willkommen zu Dive-In.
Bienvenidos a Dive-In.
Welcome to Dive-In.
Mabuhay sa Dive-In Kapistahan.
Üdvözlünk a Dive-In Fesztiválon.
Добро пожаловать на фестиваль Dive-In.
ברוכים הבאים. בואו לצלול איתנו.
Dive-In উৎসবে আপনাদের সকলকে জানাই সাদর আমন্ত্রণ।
Dive-In'e yokoso.
Benvenuti al Dive-In Festival.
Dive-In Festivali'ne hoş geldiniz.
Hello, I'm Day Bishop from Willis Towers Watson. On behalf of my co-champions for Dive-In here in the Americas, Margaret Resty-Milkent from the Jacobson Group and Noel Codispati, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. This week, you're joining over 20,000 industry colleagues that have registered for Dive-In events in more than 30 countries. We'd like to thank the more than 500 volunteers that have come together this year to put together the festival. And we'd especially like to thank our Dive-In Calgary committee. The overarching theme of the Dive-In Festival this year is Local Voices, Global Impact. And today our session is designed to help you think about the impact that diversity and inclusion can actually make. So now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Ann Kleffner, Committee Leader for Dive-In Calgary. Over to you, Ann.
Thank you very much, Day. And thank you all for being part of the Calgary 2020 Dive-In Festival. We are so thrilled to have you join us today for our second Calgary Dive-In event, Transformative Inclusion, Revolutionary Change. Inclusion is not a strategy to help people fit into the systems and structures which exist in our society. It is about transforming those systems and structures to make it better for everyone. Inclusion is about creating a better world for everyone. That's the way we approached it in the Calgary Dive-In team. And I want to start off by thanking our Calgary committee, our organizing committee, because their commitment to diversity and inclusion and their enthusiasm for raising awareness have led to this great event today, which I know will result in a very thought-provoking discussion. We are very thankful to all our local sponsors who have helped make this event possible, and their continued support has really made a big difference. Our moderator this morning is Rosetta Bilodeau. Rosetta has been in the insurance business since 1991 and began at RSA. In 2014, she moved to Rogers Insurance and has been acting as vice president. Rosetta is very proud to be part of Rogers Insurance, an organization that actively is working on diversity and inclusion on a daily basis and works hard to increase awareness and always to do more in this area. Rosetta.
Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Anne. Thank you to the Dive-In organization for having me here today. First off, I guess I'm going to say, I know you can see me very up close and personal. I'm having a little technical difficulties with my camera, so I'm up close and personal with all of you, so hopefully that'll be okay. But I'd like to welcome everyone, all the delegates, for coming in today. To our conversation today on transformative inclusion, a revolutionary change. A lot of transformation is happening globally today. As we all watch the news, there's more awareness, more discussion that is amending the world and our go forward on a day-to-day basis, which of course leads us to our platform today on transformative inclusion, a revolutionary change. We are very, very excited about the information we're going to share with you today. Before we get started, though, we'd like to kind of give you a few rules of engagement. This is an interactive, but only interactive through chat. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see the text chat window. There's a large window which holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the bottom where you will type in your questions. To send a question, simply click in the text box, type your question, and hit send. All of the questions that you submit will be seen by the presenters today, but will not be seen by all of the delegates. So your questions, we are going to be answering some questions at the end of each of the presentations today. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please put that also in the text box, and we will endeavor to help you out and get you back on track with respect to the presentation today. So that brings us now to the presentations at hand. But before we get started, we have two very esteemed speakers that I am very pleased to introduce to you today. We're very lucky to have Dr. Edward Hubbard with us today and Mrs. Kimberley Grant. Both very intelligent and experienced in the world of transformative inclusion, diversity, and all those areas. So I'd like to read you their bios because they are both very, very impressive, and I just wouldn't do justice if I tried to, just sort of shorten it. So I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. So Dr. Edward Hubbard is President and CEO of Hubbard Hubbard, an international organization and human performance consulting corporation that specializes in techniques for applied business performance improvement, diversity return on investment, DROI, measurement and analytics. We'll be hearing a lot about the DROI today from Dr. Hubbard. He is recognized globally as the founder of the diversity measurement and diversity ROI analytics field. He is the author of more than 58 business-related books, including the groundbreaking books, The Diversity Scorecard, Evaluating the Impact of Diversity on Organizational Performance, How to Calculate Diversity Return on Investment, Diversity Training Return on Investment, and many, many, many others. Thank you so much, Dr. Hubbard. This is going to be exciting. Dr. Hubbard also received the 2017 College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Alumni Award from The Ohio State University and the Legends of Diversity Award for creating the Diversity ROI Analytics and Diversity Measurements field and the associated disciplines. Dr. Hubbard serves on the Harvard Business Review, Diversity Executive Magazine, and Strategic Diversity and Inclusion Management Magazine editorial advisory boards. He also serves on the board of directors for the Ohio State University African American Alumni Society. Dr. Hubbard earned bachelor's, master's degrees from the Ohio State University and earned a PhD with honors in business administration. Thank you, Dr. Hubbard. We also have with us today Mrs. Kimberley Grant, who is the Manager, Diversity, Inclusion, and Talent Acquisition Strategy at Enbridge Inc. Kimberley is an inclusive leader, equity champion, and an executive coach. As Manager, Diversity, Inclusion, and Talent Acquisition Strategy for Enbridge Inc., Kimberley leads the company's strategies to build belonging, compassion, and equity in the workplace. Kimberley's career in human resources has spanned talent acquisition, organizational effectiveness, and change management for significant business transformative programs, including a $37 billion merger. Kimberley is also the founder and executive director of Inspira Consulting, a boutique firm specializing in leadership and team coaching. Kimberley holds a Master of Business Administration for Royal Roads University and bachelor's degrees in Psychology and Commerce from the University of Calgary, as well as certifications in adult learning, organizational change, and executive coaching. Kimberley is an avid traveler for experiencing new cultures and has visited all 7 continents. So welcome to both of our speakers today, Dr. Hubbard and Kimberley. To give us a little bit of a teaser on what we are going to be hearing today, to give us a little bit of a teaser on what we're going to hear today, transformative inclusion and a revolutionary change. Both we're going to have a little teaser from Dr. Hubbard and Kimberley. So what has that looked like in your world? Dr. Hubbard, we'll start with you first.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosetta. One of the things that we'll share with the audience during the course of the presentation will be focused on being able to look at some of the significant outcomes that can come from utilizing diversity and inclusion. In one instance, I'll share with you that an organization was able to add $1 billion to the bottom line by utilizing diversity and inclusion, and it shows and demonstrates diversity and inclusion's ability to affect the bottom line organizational performance.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Hubbard. Kimberley?
Yeah, thanks. I'll also share how we can use inclusion as a catalyst for change. By creating transparency about our diversity, Enbridge saw 2 to 9% increases in representation and opened up really strong conversations about equity, but have also been recognized by groups like the Bloomberg Equity Index, which has attracted almost $270 million worth of institutional investment.
Thank you. That sounds absolutely exciting for sure. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hubbard to start taking us through his presentation. Dr. Hubbard, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosetta. And it's a pleasure. Good morning, good afternoon, and perhaps good evening in some time zones. Thank you for the opportunity to work with you today, and it will be a conversation that focuses on being able to implement a diversity and inclusion ROI measurement strategy. And so our work today will focus on covering the following kinds of objectives. But we want to start, first of all, with a brief poll. And so here's the poll questions for you. And that is, our poll question is to ask, what are the challenges that you face in measuring the impact of diversity? You have a couple of different choices in terms of this poll question. So the question is whether or not you have challenges calculating diversity and inclusion ROI impact. Secondly, metrics to measure your cultural transformation progress, as an example. Third, being able to create accountability measures for your leaders and others in the organization. Fourth, to be able to measure employee engagement. 5, being able to set a baseline, or all of the above, which is 6. So we'll turn it back over to the control, and we'll find out and let the poll run, and you'll have an opportunity to select exactly what your responses are to the poll. And we'll give everyone a few minutes to
It looks like we might have the wrong poll up there.
Yes, I think we have the second poll, I believe. This is not the first poll. Given that that's the case, depending on whether or not we can bring the poll back up, we wanted to be able to get some sense of exactly where the audience was on the specifics. But let's go ahead and dive into the presentation. And if we have the ability to come back, we certainly will. And so with that, let's move forward and look at some of the things that we're going to cover during our time together. One of the things that we'll focus on as an objective for this section of the program is to define diversity, inclusion, equity, and diversity ROI, so that you'll have familiarity with exactly what these terms are. Demonstrate the value and the impact of diversity and inclusion on organizational performance, which is one of the things we'll talk about in more detail. And we'll also have an opportunity to explore some methods to drive measurable outcomes using diversity and inclusion as a business strategy. It's not necessarily an event. It's not something that you do as a one-off. That essentially it should be used as a process, and we're going to talk more about that. We'll also highlight some of the more common pitfalls that you'll face as a part of the process as well. So let's go on and take a look at some of our definitions. And as we think about diversity, we need to start with a definition. Diversity can be defined as a collective mixture characterized by differences and similarities that are applied in pursuit of an organization's objectives. So in other words, all of the collective mixtures that we have of differences in people inside of our organization, their differences and their similarities, we utilize those differences and similarities to be able to apply them in pursuit of the organization's objectives. When we talk about inclusion, it's the process or the act of including all of the talents and the gifts that the individuals inside of the organization bring into the organization and leverage them for the use of being able to make the culture and the climate inside of the organization better, being able to make sure that we apply it to make services delivery better for the organization and to its customers. And so we're utilizing the actual skills and gifts and talents of our workforce to be able to deliver mutual benefit to everyone involved. If we're talking about equity, equity is about being able to make sure that we are essentially attending to the individual needs of each person. So equity is different from equality because essentially you can treat people equally bad. So as part of this process, we're talking about equity where we're really sensitive to the individual needs that each person has. So we need all three of these to be able to make sure that we have an effective workplace environment in order to drive impact on the bottom line, diversity, inclusion, and equity as part of the approach. So let's talk about, for a minute, what are some of the reasons why, organizational diversity, inclusion, and equity is really important. Well, one is it helps to respect the things that are gifts that people bring into the organization. Talent is something you either use or you lose. Oftentimes, we have missed opportunities in the organization, and we're going to be able to calculate as part of this conversation what inclusion ROI is inside of the organization. So it helps us to respect and utilize the talents of others. It helps us to demonstrate the impact of diversity and inclusion on the bottom line in terms of organizational performance. And most importantly, it helps each individual to reach their full potential. And that's the reason why it's critical, because as people work and we spend most of our waking hours at work, that we want to make sure that we're able to make a contribution and be able to reach our full potential as part of the work that we're doing. So we know that as a result of utilizing diversity and inclusion, there are a whole host of workplace benefits that come out of this process. The first thing that I'll highlight here is that we know that ethnically diverse companies are 35% more likely to yield higher revenues by the use of the different ethnic backgrounds, gender, race, culture, and including everyone. And we know that the gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to also be able to increase their revenues to the bottom line. A study that was done by Glassdoor, for an example, pointed out that 57% of the employees and 67% of those who were job seekers, for an example, said that diversity and inclusion was a significant element that they look for in terms of what organizations had to offer. And it did help direct and select their choices of which organizations they'd like to work for. So it's important because it does affect recruitment and retention. So having a good D&I process and program inside of the organization is absolutely essential as you work towards being able to make sure that people feel valued, included, and respected. Now, in terms of some of the challenges that we might face when we don't necessarily use diversity and inclusion very effectively, we know that it costs organizations well over $16 billion each year due to unfair treatment in terms of the unfair treatment that you see happening inside of the organization. And it helps to drive then employee turnover and regrettable losses. We know that it costs 1.5 times the salary of the person that you lose to retain them, to replace them. So if someone makes $50,000, it costs $75,000 to replace them. And lose 12 people, that's a $900,000 hit to your bottom line. So almost $1 million hit to the bottom line of the organization if you don't necessarily have value-added processes inside of the organization, and people decide to use what we call the law of 2 feet and decide to go somewhere else to work. That's just the financial costs. We haven't even begun to talk about the cost in terms of brand image or the customer base that are affected by these individuals leaving. So we know that there's a direct impact in terms of how well you manage diversity and inclusion and its impact on the bottom line. Now, oftentimes I get a question that asks, well, how is it that diversity and inclusion really helps to drive enhanced revenue growth? And there are a number of different ways to answer that question, but I created this process called the performance drivers model, and it helps to explain some of the reasons why D&I is able to drive performance outcomes like mission accomplishment and strategic business objective accomplishment. We start with being able to have effective talent management and utilization, and that's absolutely critical. Let me give you a couple of examples to highlight this particular linear process, and it's best by way of example. One of the things we know is that Gerber baby food, for an example, if you think about a Gerber baby food jar, what's on the front label of the jar? And I'll pause for a minute and let you think about that. So if you thought about a Gerber baby food jar, you'll notice that on the front of the jar, there's, of course, a baby. Okay, and it's not just any baby, it's a white baby on the front of the Gerber baby food jar. Well, the Gerber baby food company wanted to sell baby food in Africa. They figured there were several babies in Africa who could benefit from the food. And so they didn't have a diverse marketing team when they approached this particular initiative. And what they did not understand and have cultural competency about is the fact that the way in which things are purchased, not just in Africa, this is in other parts of the world as well, at point of purchase, people made decisions about what they would buy because they look at the label of the jar, and what was on the label of the jar is indicative of what's inside the jar. So who wants to eat ground up baby? Nobody wants to eat ground up baby. And so Gerber had to pull millions and millions of dollars of product off the shelf because they couldn't sell it, because people would not buy it, because that was the cultural nuance that essentially was not caught by the marketing team. They didn't realize that they needed to have a diverse representation on the team to say, well, before you get ready to sell it that way in this part of the world, we need to be sensitive to exactly the way in which people select and buy things at point of purchase. Same thing was true with the Chevy Nova. Some of you may have experience with understanding the folklore about the Chevy Nova. Chevy Nova was a nice little car, very fuel efficient and that kind of thing. And they wanted to sell it in the Spanish-speaking countries. Well, of course, they didn't have someone on the team who had fluency in the Spanish language. And so they could have told them that, you know, you may not want to name the car the Chevy Nova because Nova, roughly in Spanish, means it doesn't go. So nobody wants to buy the Chevy It Doesn't Go car. Nobody wants to buy that car. So therefore, when we don't have inclusion, when we don't have people on the team who can bring those cultural competencies into the conversation, it doesn't allow us to have effective, enhanced organizational capabilities. So having effective talent management, being able to allow you to utilize the talents and gifts that people bring into the organization, and then leverage those gifts for making informed choice decisions about what you do next, it allows the organization to grow, to develop, to utilize and expand its capability, which allows it to be able to drive culturally sensitive and culturally relevant products and services, which then improves the outcomes for customers because you're able to improve customer satisfaction, you improve customer acquisition, for an example, customer retention as part of that process. And so what it does is ultimately help to drive enhanced revenue growth as well as mission accomplishment. So there is a line of sight process directly from the utilization of diversity and inclusion, not just the representation, but the utilization of diversity and inclusion to really drive organizational business performance. And so that's absolutely key. So as we think about, different examples that reflect this, Prudential Financial, for an example, there was a particular initiative that we worked with Prudential on, and it was focused on retention and inclusion. The first year returns was $840,000 in terms of returns back to the bottom line in the organization. And replicating best practices from that particular initiative, we're able to help the organization over a 3-year period save $31.2 million to the bottom line. In another example, by utilizing employee resource groups, because the employee resource groups teamed up with the sales organization, and they were trying to improve sell-through to the Chinese doctors as a pharmaceutical company. We created this thing called a ride-along initiative, and the ride-along initiative helped the particular ERG members to better understand what the sales reps were doing that caused them not to be able to sell through to the Chinese market. Well, they found out in the ride-alongs that they were making all kinds of major cultural faux pas. And so as a result of being able to have that experience, they were able to give them cultural competency training in the car. They were able to adjust the leave-behind documents such that they were translated into Mandarin, Cantonese. They made sure the clinical trials were reflective of those patient profiles of the doctors, and therefore it helped to improve sales. And that added $1 billion a year to the bottom line because they replicated it to every other business resource groups. They have what we call culture clubs. So we started with the Chinese culture club. It was replicated to the Russian culture club and the others and so forth. And as a result, that initiative was very successful for the organization. So what I'm saying in large part is the fact that if indeed you're using diversity and inclusion as part of your process, then essentially you're able to show demonstrated value to the bottom line. So then how do we calculate inclusion ROI? Well, there are a couple of things that you can do. So at this particular point, think about it this way. You would ask the question on a survey, and you would ask your organization as you survey them, all of the employees, to ask what percentage of your capabilities are not being used by the organization. Okay, let me repeat that. What percentage of your capabilities are not being used by the organization? And then the second follow-up question is, give examples of exactly what capabilities are not being used. So just imagine surveying your entire organization and finding out what percentage of the capabilities not being used, and then all of the capabilities that are untapped that are being listed. You would find a plethora of different types of capabilities that are available, skill sets that people have that have not been tapped to be able to use and leverage for the betterment of the organization, its climate, its culture, and its customers. And so those are kind of things that are very important. So if we wanted to calculate the actual ROI, then here are the following things that you need to jot down. So number one, let's take the average salary. So on a piece of paper, fill out a sheet of paper and then just list, okay, what's the average salary of the people that we might be talking about for any particular group? Let's say that 40% of their capability is not being used. And I'll take a hypothetical salary of $50,000, and we'll say that 40% of that is not being used in terms of capabilities not being used. And then you multiply that times the number of people. So let's say you had 4,000 people represented in that $50,000 category. So as a result, that's an $80 million loss to the company on an annual basis. So that's quite a loss. And so part of it is we understand that by not including and involving people in the processes and essentially utilizing their God-given talents, their abilities, and so forth, we miss a major part of the ability to innovate, to drive strategy, to drive process, and also to create a world-class inclusive culture as part of that process. And remember, these particular individuals also have friends, and they talk to them about the brand image, the employment brand image for the organization as well. So it's not just always a financial argument. It's also a particular set of things that we need to keep in mind that relates to the things that are the stories around those particular arguments. And I'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into the rest of the presentation. So there are metrics that you can use to be able to track some of these kinds of things. Sample inclusion metrics might include the talents used, the number and percentage of successes that were achieved, for an example, and you want both the number and the percentages, because percentages can hide a lot of sins because it's an average oftentimes, and so we need to slice it and dice it by demographic group. Or looking at the percentage of favorable response, where people felt that they were respected, they were valued, their contributions were included as part of the process. So you want to have metrics that give you feedback on whether or not people feel that they're included as part of the overall landscape of what's going on inside of the organization. And so these are things that we want to pay attention to. One of the things that we know is that there are a number of common pitfalls that may occur as part of the process as well. And so these things include things like a lack of strategic business alignment, making sure that your D&I objectives are aligned with your business objectives, or the lack of a needs analysis being conducted to find out what is it that the business needs in terms of its goals, its objectives, what are we actually doing, and that's comparing ideal versus actual, and conducting basic gap analysis to say, ideally, here's what the company wants to achieve. Actually, this is what we're doing. The gap becomes the work. And so you're focused on being able to close that gap by using D&I processes to make that happen, and also a lack of behaviorally specific actions and accountability metrics. So in order to be able to be more effective about that, I want to give you some practical tools to be able to make that happen. So on a sheet of paper, pull out a sheet of paper, and let's write and create a 5-column matrix, if you will. So you're going to have 5 separate columns, and I'm going to give you the headers for each one of those columns. So in the first column, you're going to have organizational objectives. So you would be listing in that first column, what are the pertinent organizational objectives that the organization is trying to focus on. Secondly, would be in the second column will be the D&I objectives. So the diversity and inclusion objectives would be the next column. The third column would be the diversity and inclusion metrics that are going to drive the diversity objectives, which will drive the organization's objectives. The fourth column will be the diversity initiative. So you want to list what initiative you're going to use to drive the metrics that will drive the diversity and inclusion objectives, which would drive the organization's objectives. And the final column will have the words value added, because you've got to answer the question, well, so what? What if we do this and conduct this particular initiative? What will that mean to the bottom line of the organization? So for an example, an organizational objective is the organization may say, well, we want to hire the best talent available. And most organizations have that as a part of their objective process and strategy. So the D&I objective in relationship to that objective would be to hire a diverse mixture to get the best, because a good idea doesn't have a race, gender, color, creed, sexual orientation, or physical ability. It's just a good idea, and you can get that from anyone. If you want the best ideas, you need a diverse mixture to get the best. That's why we need diverse candidate slates as part of the process. So the diverse mixture is the thing that you're aligning with the organization's objective to get the best talent. And so therefore, you may have metrics like looking at new hires by demographic group, for an example, or looking at the number of new hires retained by demographic group. That may be the next step in that process. Then you may have a retention initiative that you put in place. Could be a retention initiative like peer coaching, where you're using your employee resource groups to get people to settle in as they become a new hire into your organization. So by utilizing peer coaches, they're able to find out, where are the major things that they need to access in the organization, who they need to meet. They get introduced to the informal networks and the formal networks inside of the organization. They find out locally in the community where they can get their hair taken care of, their groceries, where they can go to practice their religion. And as a result, the value add is reduced turnover costs, Because again, going back to the notion that it costs you 1.5 times the salary of the person you lose to replace them, then it's going to be a costly proposition if you have employees who you've spent time to train them, orient them, get them involved in your process, and then they voluntarily decide to leave your organization. So by using this particular matrix, we call it a high impact map, a diversity high impact map. It's something that will allow you to be able to make sure that you do indeed maintain the organization's alignment and the diversity alignment together such that diversity and inclusion is helping to drive business process. So as we go through and look at some of the other elements of this process, we have to make sure we're tracking those metrics and analytics as we go through. So as we track the analytics and metrics, we want to use ROI-based metrics. We want to use dashboards, scorecards, and what we call SOSs, stories of success. Now, how does that relate? Well, I'm going to give you a 7-level process that we use for evaluating diversity and inclusion initiatives. And it starts with level 0. So it's a little disconcerting that I say 7 levels, but just realize that the first level is level 0. And level 0 is your diversity needs analysis. That's where you're conducting the needs analysis for the business as well as the individual performers that are a part of that process. And that's the inclusive members of the organization. So at level 1, you're looking at reaction, satisfaction, and planned actions. So you're looking at, in introducing this initiative, like your retention initiative, you're saying at the end of the day, we want to be able to evaluate how well did we do in terms of being able to address the needs that we uncovered in the needs analysis at level 0. And really, that is one of the critical points that is often missed in D&I initiatives. When I've gone back and asked, where's your needs analysis that really anchors why you're conducting this initiative, that's often missing from the landscape. So it's critical to make sure we lead with the need and keep that in mind, leading with the need. So the second level in this process is what we call learning. And that is what they know before you entered into the intervention, what do they know after? So that's a pre and post test. And so by being able to have pre and post, we can calculate net gain. So how much did people learn as part of that process? At level 3, we're talking about being able to look at application and behavior transfer. So now we're looking at whether or not the things that we actually taught them about the initiative and the things that we're going to do and conduct in the initiative, if they have transferred that back into the workplace. And so that's why we have planned actions as part of level 1, because we want them to fill out an action plan that says, here's what I plan to do with this information that you've just given me about the initiative. And I'm going to then check and see whether or not they've actually done that at level 3. At level 4, we're focused on business impact. So in looking at the fact that we had a number of regrettable losses, we had a lot of regrettable losses that was in the millions of dollars. Did we stem the tide of regrettable losses? Did we stop the turnover in the organization? So at level 4, we're looking at the business impact. Did we actually close the gap that we were working on? And at level 5, we're looking at diversity return on investment, benefit to cost ratios, and payback period. So we're calculating those particular numbers to see whether or not that happened. And at level 6, we're using SOSs or intangibles. Because you're going to have collateral benefits as part of this, where we're looking at things like improved or better, collaboration and cooperation amongst the various team members and so forth. And so as a part of this process, what you now have is a system that allows you to be able to overall look at diversity and inclusion, be able to measure it in terms of return on investment, be able to really focus on the outcomes, and really help you to get a better sense of exactly what is the impact of your D&I initiatives on the bottom line for the organization. One of the things we know is diversity and inclusion can make a measurable difference in the organization's performance, and it also allows people to reach their full potential. And that's really what the beauty of diversity and inclusion is all about. And so with that, I'll turn this over to Rosetta, and we'll begin to take some questions, I guess.
Thank you, Dr. Hubbard. That was fantastic. Some great information there. I apologize. I think we did have that little bit of a challenge with respect to your poll. So I apologize for that. And just a reminder to our delegates that if you have a question for Dr. Hubbard, to please put it in the text chat box and we will ask the question. But I do have a question for you, Dr. Hubbard. You know, as I sat here listening to you, and there's a lot of information, a lot of, steps in terms to get to that potential, what's the proper ROI. But I guess as an organization, what would you do if you were starting this today? What would be your first steps that you would want to accomplish on your journey to start this?
Okay, great question, Rosetta. Good place to start. And that good place to start is with a baseline. We would always suggest that you start with a baseline audit to say, let's take a look at exactly where we are, or a snapshot of where we are in this point in time, because you want to be able to measure against that baseline and be able to have a comparison along the way as you get feedback in moving your initiative forward, how well you're doing. You want to have informed choice judgments that you can make along the way. So where you start is being able to say, what are the metrics and the analytics that we currently are using? What are the things that we have as challenges? And this is part of the needs analysis that you essentially go through and say, what are the challenges that the organization's facing? And also, what are the individual challenges that the culture and the climate of the organization needs? And by utilizing that kind of input, and you utilize techniques like focus groups, consensus panels, surveys, and other kinds of things to get that kind of information to form your baseline. Once you have that clearly in mind, then as a team, and we talk about, Gandhi said, be the change you want in the world. We say model the inclusion and diversity that we talk about. And so therefore you would want to do this collaboratively with other people. And so you get a sense of exactly what's going on in the organization and put a strategy together to address those needs that you found. And then you begin to identify exactly what are your solution sets that you're going to use to drive it.
Great. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. Once again, I'm just going to advise our delegates that there are question capability if you want to just put it in your text. We do have a question with respect to the information being available going forward, as we have a delegate who thinks this is fantastic. So thank you to our delegate who put that up there. So we will get back to you, Ms. Taylor, and let you know what exactly will be available. We have a few things that we need to go through. Any other questions at this point in time from the delegates? Doesn't look like we have some, but I know that in our company, it's definitely something that we look at, but for us, it's more about, we're a growing company, so it's definitely about trying to integrate all of these different companies from right across the country. And so that sometimes is a bit of a difficult journey for us in making sure that you're having the same inclusion right across the country. Can you comment on anything like that?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Rosetta. One of the things that brings to mind for me is that essentially this is not something that you can take and essentially use someone else's company's approach to being able to resolve your own particular issues. So it has to be something that's organic, something that's grown directly from your organization's culture, its climate, because oftentimes people will say, well, I can understand why company XYZ is able to do that. They have bigger budgets, they have, these kinds of resources and so forth. We're different. So one of the things that we have in terms of benchmarking is to have a basic rule like this. You benchmark internally for results, you benchmark externally for process. So that way you're looking at who is best in class inside of your organization, who does D&I the best. And what are the things they've been able to accomplish in your culture and your climate to be able to make D&I work as a process? And then you look externally for those processes. You say, well, they're doing some really wonderful things here. If we think about our company, how can we, our company eyes the process so that essentially we can make it our own, but essentially use the best practices that they've seemed to being able to glean from the things that they're doing. So you have the best of both worlds. You're able to look at who's best in class in your inside of your company, and also be able to use processes from others.
No, thank you. Thank you. That's fantastic. So just conscious of time. So thank you, Dr. Hubbard. Appreciate all of the information that you have shared with us. That was fantastic. At this point in time, I'd like to turn it over to Kimberley to take us through her presentation. Kimberley, thank you.
Great, thanks, Rosetta. Dr. Hubbard has walked us through a really robust model to evaluate the impact of our programs. And now I'll build on what's been shared and talk about how you can use the data as a catalyst for change. I'm going to explore 3 factors that Enbridge has found to have impact. One is creating transparency. The second is choosing to include. And the third one is being really bold with driving change. So before I dive in, I'll share a little bit about Enbridge. Representation and inclusion are really important to my company because we fuel the quality of life for millions of people across North America. We're actually the largest natural gas utility with 3.8 million customers. We transport about 25% of the oil and 20% of the natural gas produced in North America, and our renewable assets generate enough energy to power almost 700,000 homes. So what we've experienced is that diverse groups think more critically. Homogeneity can lead to conformity, and conformity can make teams more prone to accepting ideas, including bad ones. So diversity of age, gender, race, ethnicity, and disability, among others, can really benefit a group's collective intelligence. Now, I have a quick poll for you as well, so I'm hoping that the right poll will come up. I'm curious to understand how open you feel your company is in disclosing diversity demographics. So I'll give you a moment to answer that. Okay, so we're seeing some early responses that this would be a big change, all the way to others sharing that we're sharing with senior leadership, and we've got a small percentage where all employees can openly talk about the data. 3 years ago, Enbridge made an intentional decision to create transparency about who we are. We opened our diversity data to all employees, and we found that it has made a significant impact. We found that disclosing our demographic data has really helped us to better understand the needs and preferences of our workforce. Prior to disclosing the data, when we asked people if they felt like our workforce was diverse, they would look around, look left to right, and say, yeah. But the data, however, showed that there were designated groups that were significantly underrepresented. So we found that there were voices missing around our tables and on our job sites. As an example, our assets cross or run parallel to several Indigenous nations. So on one of our recent projects, we made a conscious effort to employ over 1,100 Indigenous peoples, and found that it really did help us better understand and connect to the land. We also found that transparency has helped us to evaluate our talent programs like pay and performance equity, and representation in programs like leadership development and succession planning. And, when I look at the financial and insurance sectors, I have to admit that I get very envious because I see a really healthy mix of representation. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that the systems that you've got in place in your company are equally accessed by all people. So by creating transparency, you can help your organization look at where there may still be doors that need to be open. We found that transparent reporting really did help us influence change. So our executive leadership team reviews our diversity data on a quarterly basis and makes an effort to spotlight diverse talent in each of their senior leadership meetings. But they've also asked VPs to build action plans to ensure equitable representation in each of our business units and central functions as well. So you might be asking how we did that. Really, we started by finding committed and connected sponsors that had a vested interest, either because they themselves had reflected diversity and felt like they were the only one leading a team of others. And we also looked for people that were allies to people that had encountered marginalization and really wanted to make a difference. In 2017, we ran an internal census, and it was the first time in our company's history that we had a complete picture of our workforce demographics. And in parallel, we conducted external benchmarks to understand the demographic makeup of our communities that we operate in, as well as our labor market and labor supply. So we use these two pieces of information to really set some aspirational targets about the representation that we wanted within the company, and we created a diversity dashboard to report our workforce mix. And we also use this information to evaluate all of our people programs for equity and fairness. Moving on, I want to give you a quick peek of our diversity dashboard, and I will acknowledge up front that I'm talking about transparency, but this slide has data blocked out. Currently, we have this information completely open to all employees. However, we don't report the data externally because we want our workforce to be really comfortable with the insights first. Our dashboard was built in Power BI by our workforce analytics team in consultation with our employee resource groups. As Dr. Hubbard mentioned earlier, it's really important to have that joint consultation, and it's available via our company intranet. The dashboard shows relative representation compared to our aspirational targets for gender, ethnicity and race, disability, and veteran status, but we also collect insights for our LGBTQ employees. However, we don't currently report this data out of respect for personal privacy. And through consultation with our Prism Energy employee resource group, as we feel that people are more comfortable with this information, we definitely want to include that as well. The dashboard is fully interactive, and all employees can filter the data based on their interests. So they can filter in by business group and location, but they can also see distribution based on level, age, years of service, and job family. And there are also insights about representation for new hires, promotions, and voluntary turnover, so that leaders can make informed and evidence-based decisions around their people programs. And we found that the data has been really helpful in evaluating representation groups or gaps across levels to assess where we might have glass ceilings or sticky floors. So since 2018, we've seen an increase in women at manager level by 3% and 6% at the director level, but we've also have 9% more people of color than we did 3 years ago. So ultimately, we're aiming for proportional representation and have found that the data has really helped us to identify some barriers. Now, as Dr. Hubbard mentioned, I want to really reinforce that it's important that representation and inclusion are considered together. And it's interesting when you Google inclusion, you often see images of everyone smiling or a lot of hands coming together. And in reality, identity is a really sensitive topic and can be deeply personal. So to ensure that we had the best chance of success with our diversity and inclusion strategies, we intentionally cultivated connection. And we did this by recognizing that everyone, even those in homogenous groups, is unique and brings diversity of thought and has intersecting identities. So we embedded everyday behaviors by providing a series of tools to really help people talk about difference while also seeking common ground. And we made sure to encourage things like curiosity and empathy and assuming positive intent. It wasn't always easy, but we did hear that teams were getting to know each other on a much deeper level, and we're having conversations that they never had before. We also looked at each of our people systems and embedded cues to prompt people to really check unconscious bias and how it could be influencing decisions. As I mentioned earlier, we also had a focus on intersecting identities. So we noticed that women with disabilities were underrepresented in our organization, and we got creative and built a program to employ people with cognitive disabilities as well as physical disabilities. But we've heard that the program has been really powerful in offering meaningful employment, and a lot of our employees just comment on how rich the workplace is now that we have a broad range and a mix of people that are included. The other piece that I really wanted to dive in on is being bold and driving change. this is so important because I would share that along our journey that we had many people urge us to be cautious or advise us not to be so open. And as I shared earlier, we focused on finding active, visible sponsors that had a vested interest and were willing to share why inclusion was really important to them on a personal level. Whether it was being the first or feeling like the only one or navigating barriers that they faced in their careers, people heard firsthand how senior leaders were willing to model vulnerability and commit to inclusion. We also have this incredible force of passionate partners that are willing to step out and try new things to bring people together across difference. We launched our first employee resource group in 2005. That was Women at Enbridge. And we now have 10 groups representing 10 different affinity areas. And there's over 40 chapters across our various locations. So we have a lot of people that are involved and committed. Finally, I'd say that we've been bold in creating safe spaces for people to get curious and bridge connections. For example, over the last 2 weeks, we've run 30 listening sessions for almost 500 employees that identify as Black and or Indigenous. And we've also had these sessions for hiring leaders to explore where we might have inequity or systemic bias built into some of our systems so that we can continue to improve. And we found that these listening sessions really help to explore the different perspectives and experiences that people are having, but they've also been really incredibly powerful at informing our go-forward approach to anti-racism and equity. So that's a really quick high-level summary of some of the things that we've done at Enbridge. But I would say that as leaders in the organization, inclusion can be a significant catalyst for change, and I really do urge you to think about how you can create transparency, choose to include, and be bold about driving change in your own organizations. So perhaps with that, I'll also open it up to any questions that people might have.
Thank you, Kimberly. That was fantastic. I think we do have a couple of questions coming through. One question that I had, and I know that I think you touched on it early in your presentation around the sponsorship and that being sort of a driver of how you would change or how you would start this particular change. So maybe just wanted to, highlight that again in terms of what are the first steps in terms of creating this particular change.
Yeah, so I would echo what Dr. Hubbard shared in that you really have to meet your organization where it is. And when you're looking for sponsors, I think an important attribute of an inclusive leader is being courageous to have the conversations that need to be had. So as an example, if you've got, again, leaders that may currently represent the only face of diversity around your table or may have intersecting identities that they can draw on, how can you help that leader be comfortable talking about some of the barriers or systemic challenges that they've faced throughout their career, and then help that leader share that story so that you can build compassion and empathy and awareness that this is something that occurs at all levels, and it's something that as a sponsor that they're really committed to. So I think seeking out those leaders of influence that do reflect difference or do have a connection to difference that can bring in some of those stories and share that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great information. Great way to start. A great way to get employee engagement at that point in time, right from the bottom up kind of thing, right? There is a couple of questions here, so I'm just going to read them so that I don't misinterpret the question. So we have a question that says, when you consider your organizational diversity targets, does it take into consideration the community in which you're operating? For example, Toronto would be more diverse than Calgary, so would they have the same targets or independent targets?
Yeah, Yeah, that's an awesome question. And I want to be really clear that our targets are not quotas. So we hire based on merit, and we always want to make sure that the most highly qualified candidate is selected. When we did set our aspirational targets, we did look at representation in the communities that we operate. So we did look at differences across the organization. So we operate all across North America, in Canada and the U.S., and recognize that there's differences in populations across communities, but we did factor in census data or population data into that. The other layer that we looked at was representation in our labor market. So as an example, the vast majority of jobs that we have within our organization is a little bit different than the financial and insurance sector. The majority of our roles are technical or engineering, they're field-based. So when we looked at gender representation as an example, we knew that we had to consider the number of women that were entering and coming through technical and trade programs. There's a good reflection on Toronto as an example is that our utilities in Eastern Canada and Northeastern US have been very stable companies. So people have been working with our organization for upwards of 35 years, right? So a lack of fluctuation in opportunities meant that we as an organization didn't keep pace with the vast amount of growth in representation in the Greater Toronto area. So that was something that we really paid attention to make sure that we were focusing any hiring efforts that we did have to make sure that we were bringing in new talent that reflected the communities that we were serving. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. I do have another question here for you. Do you use an inclusion index? And if you do, what actions have you taken based on the information gathered?
Yeah, also a great question. We follow a number of different indices. So we follow a gender inclusion index. We follow an inclusion index for LGBTQ, as well as diversity index for race and ethnicity. And then in the U.S., we tie our affirmative action targets to insights for protected veterans as well. So what we found is that has helped us to really look at the programs and some of the behaviors that we want to reinforce. As an example, with our broader LGBTQ index, we looked at access and availability of our different benefits programs to support individuals who may be transitioning or going through gender transition, to make sure that people had equal access and appropriate benefits to support their transition.
Great. No, thank you so much, Kimberly. We do have, now I did notice here on the chat box, we had a couple questions that came in after we moved over to you. So maybe I'll ask Dr. Hubbard to come back on. I do have a question for both of you. It's probably the same question that both of you could answer. I'll ask Dr. Hubbard first. And the question is, do you think accountability is the foundation of D&I?
Absolutely. I think that is a great question, Rosetta, and one that we get often. And that is that there has to be accountability as a part of this process, and there should be accountability metrics that you use to be able to make sure that you're on target with that. Some of the accountability metrics might include things like tying the actual goals and the objectives for the D&I process to bonus plans, for an example. Making sure that the bonus plans are tied in lockstep with the actual strategic objectives for diversity and inclusion. There also are things like participation metrics that you can use. Sometimes we can use, we have a couple of different approaches we can use, but I'll give you an example quickly that essentially you might have a set of participation metrics where you have different levels. And that, let's say at level 1, my leader, tells us about diversity and inclusion initiatives. Let's say, for an example, it's participation in lunch and learns or, different interventions that go on in the organization that the D&I team is working on. So level one would be my boss tells me or my leader tells me that these are the initiatives that are coming up. Level two says they not only tell us, but they go with us to the actual initiative. Level three, they not only go with us and tell us, but they then speak at the particular lunch and learn, let's say. For an example, level four would be essentially that they go, they speak, and they advocate and actually provide funds to support. So then, using those kind of processes, and we make them behaviorally based, so that essentially you can say, if we're rating our leaders in terms of their accountability to D&I on a participation scale, we can say that, this executive is at level 2, this executive is at level 4, and so forth, to get some idea. And then you have a conversation with them about how they can improve their allyship with the D&I initiatives. In addition to that, being able to check and see whether or not they're meeting those objectives from a diversity and inclusion standpoint. For an example, making sure that they're looking at things like individual development plans, because when it comes time to get promoted and being a part of the succession management pool, we have to make sure we look at metrics like number of IDPs implemented versus the number of individual development plans written, because people will have IDPs written all day, but essentially they never get a chance to implement their individual development plans, like rotating through positions, be able to get the experience. So when it comes time to choose someone to be promoted, they're in that pool to be able to be selected. And they'll say, well, we would certainly like to promote Joe or Mary, but they haven't had the rotational experience. And so unless somebody's keeping tabs on that and making sure that they do get that, then essentially they will never be able to be promoted. Therefore, you won't have a diverse mixture of people in your throughout your ranks in order to make sure that they're fully represented. Those are just a couple of examples.
No, that's great. Thank you. Kimberly, I'll ask you the same question, but maybe just for your organization, how are you holding your leadership? Like, how is this accountability being done at your organization?
Yeah, first I would say that I wholeheartedly agree with what Dr. Hubbard has shared, and I would say that our dashboard has really been a tool to help hold leaders accountable. So when we look at our overarching representation metrics relative to our targets that are based on labor supply, it really helps us to have some of those conversations with leaders. So if we're seeing that there's still disproportional representation in the number of new hires that we have, or representation in promotions, then we can have those conversations directly with leaders to help them understand kind of what's occurring in that situation. But we can also use the information to do some proactive accountability holding. And by that, I say that our HR advisors will connect with leaders through the hiring process to talk about the representative mix of their teams and who might be missing around that table. And then our talent acquisition team will make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible and doing outreach to make sure that the talent pools for open positions are as diverse as possible.
Excellent.
So I think that it's created accountability from the top all the way to the front line.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Fantastic. Well, and I think you kind of answered this question already, Dr. Hubbard. Someone had put in, best way to measure leadership accountability, but I think if you're measuring it and what have you. But any other further comments on the accountability of leadership and measuring it?
Yes, I would wholeheartedly agree with Kimberly in terms of making sure it's on the scorecard, the dashboard, any tool that you have that gives feedback that helps you to better understand on a macro level exactly how things are progressing in terms of leadership accountability for these initiatives, and then on a micro level being able to make sure that participation happens and that particular initiatives like individual development plans and other kinds of actions that allows you to grow your mix of diverse talent inside of the organization is being paced with the rest of the organization. Because oftentimes those things can be left as an afterthought. And if you don't necessarily start with the metrics and the analytics first, when you're putting your D&I initiatives together, then essentially, oftentimes they take a measurement at the end, when in fact it should be thought about at the beginning and all throughout the process. So having a dashboard or scorecard, as Kimberly talked about, being able to have leadership metrics tied to incentive compensation plans that has a much more healthy bite, if you will, because if you don't necessarily put teeth in it, you're just gumming people to death. And so it's about being able to make sure that you have some teeth in your process. And it's no different than any other part of the organization. If you had a sales or a marketing initiative, it would be tied back to bonus and compensation and other kinds of incentives. I was head of compensation for a $208 billion company, and that's one of the things that we did. We made sure that indeed we had, those things linked with the bonus compensation plan, which helped us to yield tremendous results as a result. So being able to use the scorecard and dashboards that Kimberly talked about, and being able to use metrics and analytics to help drive the process and keep pace, these are the kinds of things that are effective.
No, great. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Just looking at the questions. So there are a couple of questions with respect to this presentation being recorded and if they can access it after the meeting. I do believe that it is being recorded. We are just, I think, in the final sessions as to how we're going to be able to have this released to all of our delegates and what have you. We're just waiting on some information on that. But it is being recorded, so I think there will be the ability to get you some of this information after the fact. I had one more question coming in here, and it said, from our Delegate Morris, great topic and conversation, excellent speaker. So thank you again, Dr. Hubbard, Kimberly, fantastic. What 3 measures should be part of everyone's DEI metrics? Kimberly?
Oh, I'm actually going to pass to Dr. Hubbard first.
Okay. All right, Dr. Hubbard, let's go with you.
Well, there's a great path there, Kimberly. It's always the scientific thing. It depends. It really does depend. And the reason why I say that is because it's a great question that's being asked. People wonder, well, what are the top 3 measures that I need? Well, part of it depends on what your strategy is, your goals, and your objectives are. You always start with your goals, objectives, and with that needs analysis saying, what is it that our organization needs? And then based upon that, then what are the critical things that we want to identify where we're closing the gap? And those are the things that we need to have metrics and analytics around so we can make sure that that gap gets closed. Because without doing and conducting that needs assessment, you have no idea of which measures are going to be most relevant, which things and processes are going to help drive your approach and yield the kind of outcome that you want. So in terms of being able to find out what are the top 3 measures, once you've completed your needs analysis and highlighted and prioritized the things that have come out of that needs assessment, you'll get a much better sense of exactly what are the measures you need to track and also the kind of processes you need to track. And the other thing I'll say is check it often. Check your results often, make adjustments where you need to make them so that you don't wait until the end of the year and say, oh, we missed the mark, and it's too late then. You have to be able to have good feedback mechanisms, and as Kimberly talked about, having a scorecard or a dashboard gives you that kind of feedback, and the metrics and the analytics that I talked about will help you to have a way to populate that scorecard and dashboard to be able to make it happen.
Excellent. Thank you. Kimberly, anything to add?
Yeah, thanks for letting me do that pass, because I'm actually I'm listening very intently to Dr. Hubbard because I'm also learning. I would say that if I were to narrow it down to 3, one would be representation. So looking at your representation across all levels and locations. The second, I would say, would be equity in your programs. So, for example, pay equity is incredibly important because we know globally that there is disproportionate representation there. And then I would say that the third one is really around engagement and inclusion. So as you're doing engagement surveys with your organization, have conversations around how comfortable people really do feel about being themselves in the workplace, because we do hear so much about the emotional tax that people are carrying based on what's happening in society. And we also hear about the pressure to cover or code switch when you come into the organization. So I think measuring some of those things around engagement will help you to uncover where you might have blocks or barriers for people.
Great.
Let me also mention something else too, Rosetta, if I could.
Sure, of course.
Just to build on what's already been said, the other thing I'd like to make clear is make sure you utilize both representation and utilization, because oftentimes what happens is that people will say that, well, our diversity metrics really focus on how many people we have represented. And you can have representation across the board by each demographic group, but if you don't utilize people to really leverage their talents, their gifts, and their abilities, then essentially you don't get the true benefit of diversity and inclusion. So it's not only just representation, it's utilization. It's not counting heads, it's about making heads count. And so it's about being able to make sure you do that. Okay?
Yeah, no, I love it. So thank you. I mean, we're coming close to our time here, so I'll kind of move forward a little bit and pose a question, I think, to our delegates and just say, you know, with respect to coming to this presentation today, we're hoping that this did meet the objective in terms of why you wanted to attend today. And so a question we have for you is, what is one of the most valuable insights you will action to revolutionize your approach to diversity and inclusion at your organization? And maybe we can get some people to put up some answers in the chat box and we can see what kind of things resonated with people today. See if we have a flurry. Oh, accountability is a big one. Actions, follow-up, important. Lots of actions, a lot of accountability. Yeah, fantastic. No, this is great. You know, one final comment from each of our speakers on transformative inclusion, a revolutionary change that you want to leave our delegates with today, Dr. Hubbard?
Yes, I guess the way I would kind of sum it up is to make sure that you use D&I metrics. Of course, I'm partial to that, and essentially make certain that you do indeed have inclusive processes. I'd like to end it by saying that there are three, what I usually know is that there are three kinds of people in the world: those who make things happen, those who watch things happen, and those who wonder what happened. We don't want people to be in that last category, wondering what's happening. You have a lot of resources in diversity and inclusion, and that's the power of inclusion in this whole process. So go out and make something happen, and you have a lot of people who will help you.
Oh, fantastic. And Kimberly, one final parting that you want to leave with them?
Yeah, I think, again, just echoing what I had shared, create transparency, like really use your demographic insights to start the conversations that need to be had, and choose to consciously include people. Listen to what they need in the organization, and then finally be bold. Like have the courage to take some bold action and make some change. Yeah, because as leaders, you have this tremendous opportunity to make a difference for people, and you know, use inclusive information to drive some really strong business decisions.
Oh, great. Well, that pretty much brings us almost right to our 90 minutes. So I want to take a moment and really thank Dr. Hubbard and Kimberly. Your insight, your experience has been fabulous. I think from some of the comments that we've been seeing coming through the chat box, People have been really resonating with both of your messages. It looks like people are quite excited by what you've been talking about today to bring it back to their organization. So definitely thank you to both of you for being included in this particular presentation. We want to thank our sponsors because we couldn't have been able to do this at all without our sponsors. So a big thank you to them. And again, thank you to all of our delegates for taking the time out today of their busy schedules, because everyone has a busy schedule these days, and learning a little bit more. And hopefully this will drive some revolutionary change in your organization that transform inclusiveness. So I'd like to end with just a little quote. I'll steal it from Dr. Hubbard again. We are all part of this revolutionary change, and to quote Gandhi, be the change you wish to see in your world. So with that, thank you, everybody. Take care and have a wonderful day.